Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Ellis and today I will be speaking with you about the Johnstown Flood. The Johnstown Flood was a great tragedy that occurred in Johnstown, Pennsylvania during the 19th century. Johnstown was a river valley located on the Appalachian Plateau that was home to Lake Conemaugh, which was 450 feet higher than Johnstown itself. As a result, this lake was held up by the South Fork Dam, which had been neglected for many years. Johnstown was used to flooding at least once a year, and the civilians would go up to the top of the highest level of their house, and because the river would overflow in the streets. These floods would be caused by heavy rainfall or the snow melting too fast in the spring. It was a widespread notion throughout the town that this dam would not hold, but each year it was proven wrong and the dam did hold. City residents were accustomed to climbing to the top of their homes, and so this flood was no different, and they just thought it was going to be the same thing as it had always been. But this flood became much worse as the dam broke, and on May 31st, 1889, the residents were not prepared for what was to come. Over 2,000 people were killed in this disaster, which could have been prevented or lessened by a better dam. And those who saw it, it was only 10 minutes long, but it probably seemed like a century. And those who saw it did describe it as a rolling hill of debris. The final death toll was 2,209 people, and those who survived were trapped in their attics or left floating on debris and may have ended up dying later. By mid-morning, the interagency coordination for Johnstown Flood, by mid-morning, the government officials had been working to avoid a dam failure, and water had been in the streets since early morning. It was causing alarm across Johnstown, and the officials tried several different procedures to prevent the flood. The first attempt was to add height to the dam so that if the water rose that it wouldn't overflow, and after that didn't work, they dug a second spillway to relieve pressure from the breast. And finally, they released the heavy screens placed on the overflows to keep the stock fish from escaping into the streams below. The government never saw such a disaster coming. They weren't prepared at all. They thought that the dam would hold, and they never thought that it would become of the magnitude that it did. The response of the government was limited to the technology at the time of the tragedy. Because this did occur in 1889, they had very limited technology, and they didn't have the equipment to prevent such a surge of water. However, today, we had Hurricane Katrina just several years ago, and it was a very similar tragedy. A dam broke and killed over 1,000 people. And still, even though we had all the technology to prevent such tragedy, we didn't prevent it. So, even if they had had the technology back then, they may have not prevented it still. There was no public citizen notification or communication about the water breaking, the flood occurring, and it was actually just after 3 p.m. on the day of the flood that people watched as the dam just slipped away, just broke, and the water came pouring through the streets. There was an estimated force of the Niagara Falls from the water, and the body of water measured at 20 million tons, and that was just an hour after the dam broke. The water brought with it 14 miles of accumulated debris, which included houses and barns and living and dead people. And at times, the floodwater was 60 feet high and coming through the town at 40 miles per hour, taking everything in its sight with it. The response to the flood seemed to have brought people together. Over 100 newspapers and magazines sent reporters to the scenes. They all wrote stories of the aftermath, even though a lot of them weren't true. People still from other cities related to the citizens of Johnstown and wanted to help them. They sent, doctors left their practices and went to Johnstown to help people. Medical places sent supplies, and people just sent anything that they could to help. And survivors, they set up tents to live in. Most of the time they set them up near where their homes had been, and that's where they lived until they could rebuild their houses. And emergency morgues were set up throughout the cities. They were using churches and any building that was left standing to house all the bodies that were left so that people could identify them. And some people were never identified. Some people were missing and never found. As far as rebuilding the city goes, the stores on Main Street actually opened 1 month after the flood, and even though the city never fully got back to normal, it was hard to tell within 5 years. People coming to visit the city, visitors would have never known that something had happened. And so the community did a really good job cleaning up the city and getting it back to the way that it was, even though it never really fully restored itself. Within 5 years, it was back to normal. And you can again compare that to Hurricane Katrina, where New Orleans is nowhere near where it should be. And it's been 5 years now. For mitigation measures, there was no legislation enacted after the flood. There was nothing done to protect the people who had been victims of the flood. There was nothing done to protect the city from future floods. And the blame was actually placed on the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club for, by the survivors of the flood. They had placed the blame on these members. And that was just because the dam had been purchased by this club, and they hadn't upkept the dam, and they hadn't made sure that it was going to hold this body of water, and that's why the survivors placed the blame on them. And there was no compensation by legislation or legally for the survivors of the flood. They got nothing. And each year, the city of Johnstown continued to be plagued by floods. And it took 47 more years of floods before anything was done. There was more property damage, more lives lost, and nothing was done for 47 years about this flood issue. And finally, something was finally done. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time, and I hope you learned something.